In today's video, we cover when Karens try conquering K2 and all died hours later. From a Karen who reaches the summit unaware that a chain of failures had already begun dismantling her body, to a Karen who pushes past every warning, ignoring the mounting signs of deterioration creeping in. It was July 18th, 2014 on K2, rising through the isolated Karakoram Mountains, along the high-altitude boundary zone between northern Pakistan and western China, an area defined by long glacial valleys, shifting ice fields, and rapidly changing summit conditions. Rachel Comia was 29 years old and worked as a physical therapist in Portland, Oregon. She and her husband had built their climbing experience through the Pacific Northwest and the Andes, developing a steady, methodical progression into technical terrain. K2 represented a significant step beyond that range, where conditions above 26,000 feet leave little margin for error. Months before the expedition, her objective evolved into a personal documentary-style summit attempt, centered on carrying part of her wedding dress for summit photography, treating it as a symbolic anchor rather than standard gear. After early sponsorship support collapsed, the project became more self-directed and informally structured, with added emotional weight placed on completing the visual concept. Bringing something like that up there changes how every decision feels. Even small ones start getting tied to it. She joined a commercial expedition operating along the standard southeast ascent corridor, where multiple teams, fixed lines, and overlapping camps created congestion under unstable Karakoram summer conditions. During acclimatization, she experienced variable weather, including snowfall and wind loading. At Camp 3, she developed persistent cough, reduced appetite, and fragmented sleep, but continued filming despite incomplete recovery between rotations. At higher camps, guides started noticing she wasn't recovering as quickly and needed more help with basic tasks. Before the summit push, she reshuffled her gear and cut back on emergency insulation, just to make space for filming equipment and the wedding dress, which stayed easy to reach the whole way up. The summit push began overnight in deteriorating conditions. Congestion along fixed ropes led to prolonged static exposure in extreme cold, while several climbers turned back. Rachel continued upward with a smaller group after falling behind the main flow during repeated pauses to manage gear and reposition the dress within her pack system. Throughout the ascent, the dress became a recurring point of interruption. Brief stops to adjust its placement beneath outer layers or prevent snagging on harness components created small but repeated delays between rope transitions. These pauses accumulated into increased spacing from her rope partners, though no single moment was considered critical in isolation. She eventually reached the summit later in the rotation, under conditions already outside the initial weather window. Descent began immediately afterward, in worsening visibility and increasing wind. As she moved down from the summit, additional pauses occurred to resecure and reposition the dress after it shifted under layered clothing during exertion. These brief stops, combined with fatigue and cold, gradually increased separation from her husband and the other climbers ahead of her during fixed-line transitions, where spacing was already fragile. Near the upper descent corridor, reduced visibility and fresh snowfall obscured markers and rope anchors. During one of these intervals, a hesitation to fully resecure her gear before continuing resulted in a further delay at a junction between established and secondary descent lines. That small spacing gap caused her to drift off the main tracked corridor into a less defined route below overlapping footprints. In whiteout conditions, everything starts to look like it might be the right way, even when it isn't. As conditions got worse, she kept following what looked like the main line without realizing she had drifted off it. The ground slowly changed into a soft, snow-covered slope above a hidden field of crevasses, with a buried snow bridge stretching over a void underneath the fresh snow. When she stepped onto the concealed bridge, the structure collapsed under load, sending her into a deep crevasse system below the descent path. Investigators later concluded that the snow bridge showed no visible surface indicators at the time of travel due to recent snowfall and wind redistribution. Search operations began once weather conditions improved, but access Delays and unstable snowpack slowed ground response. Her body was later recovered approximately 80 feet below the entry point during a brief recovery window, supported by aerial reconnaissance. The expedition review identified contributing factors, including fatigue during descent, deteriorating weather, separation from the main rope group during repeated gear management pauses, and navigation drift in near whiteout conditions. The final assessment emphasized that the critical failure point was not a single technical error, but a hesitation-driven delay pattern linked to repeated interruptions while managing personal gear, which ultimately led to loss of spacing, route deviation, and entry onto unstable terrain. It was July 22, 2017, and summit day weather on K2 was almost too perfect. Wind at 27,000 feet, barely registered, 5 to 10 miles per hour, the kind of stillness K2 offered 3 or 4 days per season. The conditions had drawn every expedition into a simultaneous push, creating a line of climbers stretching from Camp 4 through the bottleneck that moved with the efficiency of rush hour traffic. Renata Cavalcanti was 31, a former competitive triathlete from São Paulo who had transitioned to mountaineering with the same intensity she brought to racing. She had summited Aconcagua twice and reached 24,500 feet on Manaslu before weather forced a retreat. K2 was her statement piece, the mountain that would separate her from the recreational climbers she considered beneath her ability. And I'll be honest, on paper, Renata had the resume and the fitness to be there. That's what makes this one harder to sit with than most. Her lead Sherpa was Furba Thendu, 36 from the Makalu region, with 5 26,000-foot summits including K2 the previous season. Furba tracked conditions the way a pilot tracked instruments, constantly, automatically, without being asked. They departed Camp 4 at 10 p.m. on July 21st. Renata's fitness showed early, consistent pace, controlled breathing, but the bottleneck traffic was severe. What should have taken 90 minutes stretched past 3 hours, climbers standing clipped to fixed ropes, burning oxygen and body heat while waiting for the line above to move. They cleared the bottleneck at 6:15 a.m. and continued upward. By 11:30, Renata was at 27,800 feet, with roughly 450 vertical feet to go. Furba calculated their pace against the expedition's turnaround time of 2 p.m. They would not summit before 2:30. He recommended turning back. Renata rejected the recommendation. She felt strong, the weather was perfect, and turnaround times were guidelines, not laws. Furba countered that the turnaround existed specifically for days like this, when the weather felt safe enough to justify 1 more hour, and that 1 more hour meant descending the bottleneck in darkness beneath an unstable Sirac. I've covered enough of these stories to know that when someone starts calling turnaround times guidelines, they've already made the decision that gets them killed. Renata continued climbing. Furba followed, because the alternative was abandoning his client above 27,000 feet. Renata reached the summit at 3:08 p.m., more than an hour past turnaround. She spent 11 minutes before beginning descent at 3:19 p.m. The math was now a countdown. The bottleneck was roughly 4 hours below. Sunset arrived around 7:30. The Serac above the bottleneck was most unstable during temperature transitions, when warming and cooling cycles stressed fracture lines. They descended efficiently, but the hours of climbing had extracted a toll that adrenaline could not repay. Renata's legs had lost their morning elasticity. Her crampon placements, still accurate, came slower. Her oxygen supply was running lower than Furba wanted to see. The sun dropped toward the western ridges, and the temperature began its evening plunge, the kind of rapid cooling that stressed the hanging Serac as the ice contracted. They entered the top of the bottleneck at approximately 6:40 p.m. in fading light, the gully empty, every other climber long gone. Every other team had cleared the bottleneck hours earlier. That fact alone should tell you everything about where Renata's decision put them. At 7:02 p.m., roughly halfway through, the Serac released. The sound came first, a deep crack that resonated through rock and ice. Then a section of the ice wall fractured along a 60-foot line and began to fall. Furba heard it, looked up, and threw himself into a shallow depression in the gully wall. Renata, 15 feet below on the fixed line, did not react in time. The avalanche of ice debris swept through the bottleneck, ripped the fixed ropes from their anchors, and carried her off the face. The fall was not survivable. Her body was never recovered. Furba Thendu survived with bruises and a cracked rib, but the proximity of the collapse broke something that bones could not account for. He attempted to resume guiding the following season and froze on a fixed rope during an acclimatization climb on Amadablam, unable to move. Overwhelmed by panic, he was helped down and never returned to high altitude. He now runs a small equipment repair shop in Namche Bazaar. He does not discuss K2. That detail stayed with me longer than I expected. A man who had stood on 5 26,000-foot summits, paralyzed at 20,000 feet by something no amount of experience could fix. The Serac does not care about turnaround times. It falls when physics says it falls. But the people who set those deadlines understood something Renata did not. At Community Forge, you cannot control the Serac, so you control how long you spend beneath it. It was July 26th, 2017, on the upper Abruzzi spur of K2, just below Camp 4, at an elevation of approximately 7,800 meters. Conditions were stable by K2 standards. Wind speeds, which often fluctuated sharply in this section of the route, had eased into a steady flow, and temperatures remained near minus 28 degrees Celsius, cold but within the expected operational range for a summit attempt. Visibility was clear enough to track headlamps moving slowly above camp as teams staged their ascent. The environment showed no immediate signs of escalation. Below the climbers, the glacier was still. Above them, the bottleneck remained intact, unchanged, heavily loaded, and structurally unstable in the same way it had been for days. At 3:42 a.m., Elena Markovic, 34, clipped into the fixed rope and moved away from Camp 4. She was a structural engineer from Zagreb. She had more than 10 years of experience climbing at high altitude and had already reached the summits of Manaslu and Cho Oyu with supplemental oxygen. Her approach to climbing was careful and methodical. She planned each step, followed established procedures, and avoided unnecessary risks. Friends later described her as deliberate and patient, someone who rarely rushed decisions and preferred to work within clear limits rather than push beyond them. Family members said she treated climbing the same way she treated her engineering work, preparing extensively and believing that discipline and consistency mattered more than bold moves. Today was Elena's first attempt on K2. She was part of a commercial expedition that provided shared Sherpa support only up to Camp 4. Above that elevation, climbers moved independently along fixed lines installed earlier in the season. She was familiar with the mountain's history and understood that K2 rarely allows delayed decisions or partial retreats once a summit push begins. Timing errors on this route do not compound gradually. They narrow options until movement becomes mandatory. Her decision to climb that morning was shaped less by confidence than by constraint. Her summit permit was set to expire in 3 days, and the expedition's operational plan required the immediate removal of high camps after the current push. Forecast models showed no additional weather window within the remaining permit period. Turning back would not preserve the attempt. It would end it, with no opportunity for a second rotation and no mechanism to pause and reset. Elena clipped into the line and began moving upward, committing to a system that offered only forward progress and no meaningful recovery once its limits were crossed. Above Camp 4, the Abruzzi spur narrows into an exposed passage where climbers, snow and ice are forced into the same limited space. The slope steepens, footing changes from step to step, and the route funnels everyone towards the bottleneck, a slanted gully that runs beneath a large block of hanging ice. That ice weighs thousands of tons and does not act as a single solid piece. It shifts as temperatures rise and fall, cracks form inside it, and gravity pulls unevenly along its underside. Small pieces break off during the season, often without hitting anyone, but there is no reliable way to predict when a larger collapse might occur once climbers are already moving below it. To pass through this section, climbers depend on a system where every part must work at the same time. Fixed ropes are anchored into ice and rock, keeping climbers attached to the slope and preventing long falls on ground that cannot be climbed safely without constant connection. Supplemental oxygen offsets the thin air, allowing climbers to think clearly enough and move with some control. Speed here is not about pushing limits, but about reducing time spent under the hanging ice and avoiding backups that increase exposure. This system only works within narrow limits. Ropes assume stable footing, oxygen depends on steady flow in extreme cold, and feet must feel the ice to confirm placement on surfaces that range from solid to fragile. None of these parts can replace another. Above 8,000 meters, the system has no capacity for recovery. Elena did not sleep well that night. Earlier, her oxygen regulator had begun to ice, causing short interruptions in airflow that required repeated adjustments. Each time the flow returned to normal, and the problem never reached a level that would justify turning back, but it was enough to stand out as a small change from how the system was supposed to work. Before leaving Camp 4, she removed her right boot to improve circulation. The foot felt numb at first, but sensation returned after she warmed it with her hands. There were no visible signs of injury, no discoloration, no swelling, and no pain that suggested frost damage. She put the boot back on and tightened the buckles, but one of the lower buckles seated slightly off-center, creating uneven pressure along the side of her foot. At a lower altitude, that kind of misalignment would have been trivial. At this elevation, it would quietly begin to matter. Elena clipped into the fixed rope and began climbing, committing to the route and the narrow window the mountain was offering. From the moment Elena left Camp 4, the sequence that led to failure was already underway, though nothing about it appeared urgent at the time. During the first phase of the climb, her movement remained steady. The fixed rope was secure, her breathing was controlled under oxygen, and the pressure from the lower buckle on her right boot registered only as mild tightness. There was no pain and no immediate loss of function. Over the next 30 to 40 minutes, as she gained altitude toward the bottleneck, the effects of that pressure compounded. At nearly 8,000 meters, the body naturally restricts blood flow to the extremities to preserve oxygen for vital organs. The added compression along the outer edge of her foot further reduced circulation in that area. This sequence was later supported by examination of her boot, which showed uneven wear and deformation around the lower buckle, consistent with prolonged, localized pressure during ascent. By approximately 1 hour into the climb, tissue temperature in the affected area had dropped enough to interfere with nerve signaling. This progression was confirmed during post-recovery assessment, which documented frost necrosis extending upward from the lateral side of the foot, indicating prolonged cold exposure rather than a sudden injury. The absence of blistering or surface damage suggested that the injury developed gradually, without producing pain signals that would have prompted an immediate response. Despite this, Elena retained full strength in the leg and continued to bear weight, reinforcing her decision to proceed within the limited summit window. What changed was sensory feedback. Investigators later concluded that diminished proprioception likely impaired her ability to confirm precise foot placement on variable ice. This assessment aligned with witness accounts describing increasing instability during descent rather than a single triggering event. By 5:10 a.m., Elena reached the lower edge of the bottleneck. Climbers ahead of her slowed as one person struggled to free a frozen carabiner from the fixed line, creating a brief backup in the narrow couloir. Several climbers later reported that conditions at that point felt typical for K2. Light spindrift slid down the gully in short bursts, and small pieces of ice released from the serac overhead, sounds and movements that were common enough not to trigger alarm. Elena paused to rest while waiting for the line to clear. According to climbers behind her, she shifted her weight onto her left leg and briefly lifted her right foot, flexing it before stepping back into position. When she resumed climbing, her movement appeared controlled, but slightly slower than earlier sections. As she moved higher, Elena's oxygen flow began to fall out of sync with her breathing. Post-incident inspection of her equipment later showed moisture buildup inside the regulator, consistent with partial freezing at that altitude. Witnesses recalled hearing her adjust the valve and increase the flow rate, a common response that temporarily restored airflow but also increased oxygen use and physical strain. At approximately 8,100 meters, Elena stopped again on a short, steep section of ice. One climber below her later stated that she hesitated longer than expected before stepping up. When Elena lifted her right foot to move higher, the motion lacked its earlier precision. The crampon did not clear the ice lip cleanly and drifted slightly before she corrected the placement using her ice axe. She completed the step and continued. Climbers nearby later said the correction looked deliberate rather than panicked, suggesting she was still in control. Elena did not turn around. With the summit close and her permit window closing, she continued upward. At extreme altitude, loss of fine control often appears before any loss of strength. Investigators later concluded that Elena's right foot was no longer providing reliable feedback. She could still apply force, but she could not consistently confirm exact placement. At roughly 8,200 meters beneath the Serac, she leaned into the fixed line and stepped onto what appeared to be solid ice. The surface collapsed into a thin crust over softer snow, dropping her foot several centimeters. The movement was not enough to cause a fall, but it forced her ankle to rotate under load. Medical review later confirmed ligament damage, consistent with that type of twist. Elena did not react as someone in pain would. The rope absorbed the shift in balance, and she stabilized and continued climbing. However, the joint was now mechanically compromised, and circulation, already reduced by cold and compression, was effectively cut off. From that point forward, post-recovery findings showed the foot was no longer viable, even though Elena had no immediate way to recognize that the system had crossed a point from which it could not recover. At 7:02 a.m., Elena reached the summit of K2. According to radio logs and witness accounts from climbers who arrived shortly before and after her, conditions at the top were stable. Wind speed remained consistent with the early morning forecast. Visibility was clear, and there were no signs of incoming weather or sudden environmental change. Elena stayed for less than 3 minutes, long enough to confirm her position by radio and take a single photograph. No witnesses reported her removing her boots or sitting down, which aligned with standard high-altitude practice to avoid cooling and loss of circulation before descent. Problems began shortly after she started down. Climbers descending behind her later reported that Elena appeared increasingly reliant on the fixed rope, keeping more weight in her harness than expected for that section of the route. Equipment inspection after recovery supported this observation. Her oxygen regulator showed signs of moisture buildup and freezing, consistent with a valve that had stuck partially open. This would have caused oxygen to drain faster than planned, reducing her available supply and increasing physical strain during the descent. Witnesses also noted irregular foot placement as she approached the upper section of the bottleneck. One climber below her later told investigators that Elena's right foot appeared to slide or hesitate before several steps, even though conditions on the ice were unchanged. As her oxygen supply dropped and fatigue increased, more weight shifted into her arms and upper body, reducing her ability to correct small missteps. Near the top of the bottleneck, Elena reached a section where the fixed rope angled slightly downward and the ice surface changed from hard blue ice to a thin layer of compacted snow. To move through this transition, she attempted to step down onto a narrow ledge while still weighted into the rope above her. Witnesses later said this was a common place for missteps, as the ledge was shallow and sloped away from the climber rather than into the mountain. When Elena placed her right foot, the front point of her crampon failed to bite cleanly into the snow. Instead of locking in, it skated a short distance. Because she was already leaning into the rope, the slip did not turn into a free fall. The rope caught her immediately, but the sudden drop forced her body weight downward, while her foot was still partially planted. Her right ankle twisted sharply under load. Climbers nearby reported hearing a dull impact rather than a slide, consistent with a joint collapsing rather than a fall continuing. Later examination confirmed that the ankle joint suffered a catastrophic failure, leaving it unable to support weight or maintain stability. Elena remained hanging in the rope, upright but unsupported by her legs. She tried to place her foot back on the slope but could not control it. Climbers above and below moved in to secure her, clipping her into a nearby anchor to prevent further movement. They attempted to help her stand by shifting weight off the injured leg, but witnesses later said her lower body did not respond in a coordinated way. She could not bear weight, and she could not assist in repositioning herself. At that point, her ability to descend under her own power was gone, and the situation moved beyond anything that could be corrected on the mountain. Rescue above the bottleneck was not a realistic option, even with experienced climbers nearby. At that altitude, helicopters cannot operate safely or hover with enough control to attempt a lift, and no aircraft capable of reaching that height was available in the region. There was also no spare oxygen staged above Camp 4 that could be brought to Elena in time. Any additional cylinders were stored far below, and carrying them back up through the bottleneck would have taken hours and required climbers to re-enter the same danger zone she was trapped in. The terrain itself made rescue mechanically impossible. The bottleneck is a steep, narrow couloir with hard ice underfoot and a massive hanging serac directly overhead. There is no flat ground, no secure platforms, and no room to set up a hauling system. Lowering an injured climber would have required multiple anchors, controlled rope systems, and coordinated movement, all while other teams were still moving through the same fixed line. Any hauling or lowering attempt would have placed rescuers directly beneath the Serac and in the same fall path as Elena, creating a serious risk of multiple fatalities. For this reason, climbers later told investigators that attempting a technical rescue would likely have caused more deaths without improving her chances of survival. Elena remained clipped into the fixed rope and secured to an anchor while nearby climbers descended to alert the expedition team below. As minutes turned into hours, the oxygen she had left continued to drain, and the cold further reduced her ability to stay conscious or responsive. She could not stand, could not shift her weight, and could not assist in her own descent. There was no way to warm her, no shelter to protect her from wind and exposure, and no treatment that could be administered at that elevation. She was effectively immobilized in a place where immobility is fatal. When climbers returned later with additional support and limited supplies, Elena was no longer responsive. At some point during the wait, she had lost consciousness as oxygen levels dropped and her body temperature continued to fall. There were no signs of a sudden final injury or collapse. According to a later medical review, her condition declined steadily, consistent with prolonged exposure and worsening hypoxia at extreme altitude, until her body could no longer sustain itself. The investigation showed that Elena did not die from a single sudden event. The cause of death was determined to be hypoxia, combined with traumatic failure of the lower limb, meaning her body was deprived of oxygen, while a severe leg injury prevented her from moving or descending on her own. Neither factor alone would have been immediately fatal, but together they removed all remaining options. Investigators found no evidence of a storm, ice collapse, or one decisive mistake. Instead, a series of small problems accumulated, each reducing her ability to respond until the system could no longer recover. Examination of Elena's right foot revealed deep frost necrosis extending above the ankle, confirming that a frost injury had begun hours before she reached the summit. The injury developed without pain or obvious warning, gradually disrupting nerve signals and making foot placement unreliable. By the time the ankle failed during the descent, the underlying damage was already advanced. Investigators concluded that when Elena stood on the summit, the outcome was effectively set, even though there was no clear moment when that became visible. Elena Markovich did not die because of a reckless decision made at the summit. There was no sudden mistake, no ignored warning, and no external event that forced the outcome. Her death had already begun earlier, when a small mechanical issue combined with the limits of the human body at extreme altitude and pushed the system past its point of recovery. By the time the injury showed itself during the descent, the outcome was no longer negotiable. When Elena stood on the summit of K2, she was still alive, still moving, and still making decisions. But the system that kept her alive had already failed. She just had no way of knowing it yet. It was August Lasectin, 2015 on K2, rising in the central Karakoram system near the frontier between Pakistan and China, an environment shaped by towering ice seracs, narrow ascent corridors, and long exposed ridgelines above 26,000 feet. Nicole Ambon was 27 years old and worked as a wedding planner in Denver, Colorado. Known for structure and precision in her professional life, she approached the expedition with the same planning mindset, where outcomes were expected to follow preparation. K2, however, operated outside that logic, where environmental limits override scheduling and control. In the months before the climb, she set a personal goal tied to reaching the summit before turning 30, framing the ascent as a symbolic transition point. The idea of a summit photograph became part of that milestone narrative, adding personal meaning to the objective beyond the climb itself. She had limited high-altitude experience above 20,000 feet, enough to understand early acclimatization effects, but not the sustained decline typical above 8,000 meters. She joined a lower-cost guiding operation on the Abruzzi Spur, where logistical margins were thinner and timing flexibility more constrained than on larger commercial expeditions. A small public fundraising effort also tied external attention to her success, reinforcing the sense of a defined outcome. Acclimatization progressed unevenly. She required slower rotations and additional recovery time, and by Camp 3 showed swelling in extremities and persistent fatigue beyond expected levels. Guides noted the symptoms but continued the schedule due to a narrowing weather window and the need to commit to a summit attempt while conditions briefly stabilized. Before the summit push, she carried a lightweight white dress and camera equipment intended for summit documentation. To accommodate this, she reduced backup provisions and redundancy in her load, slightly narrowing her physiological and safety buffer in an environment where margins are already minimal. It always looks like a small trade-off when you're packing. Nobody really feels the consequence of it yet at that point. The summit rotation began under deteriorating conditions. Above 26,000 feet, her movement slowed, and fixed-line progress required frequent pauses and assistance. Despite this, she continued upward and reached the summit late in the operating window, entering descent as weather and visibility began to decline. Instead of turning back right away, she stopped for a short moment near the summit to take it in and get a quick shot tied to the goal she'd been aiming for. That delay pushed her onto a later descent schedule, putting her into the afternoon hours when the snow higher up tends to get less stable. Descent toward the bottleneck occurred as conditions shifted into warmer afternoon instability. The traverse below the hanging glacier funnels climbers into a narrow corridor beneath exposed serac walls where even small timing delays increase exposure to overhead hazard. As she moved below the summit zone, her descent became slower and more intermittent, with longer pauses on steep sections before resuming with assistance from fixed lines. Fatigue and altitude-related impairment became more visible, and spacing between her and the main group gradually widened during transitions between anchors, reducing collective movement control in the corridor. It's like everything just gets erased in one stretch of movement. While multiple teams were descending through the same constrained passage, a section of overhead ice and accumulated snow released from above the traverse. The collapse expanded quickly into an avalanche flow that crossed the fixed ropes, striking climbers on the route and overwhelming the narrow channel beneath the bottleneck. Nicole was swept from the slope and carried downslope within the moving snow and debris field, disappearing from view below the traverse as the flow continued across uneven terrain. Immediate rescue was not possible due to continuing instability in the release zone, reduced visibility, and the risk of secondary slides in the same corridor. Search operations were delayed until conditions stabilized several days later. Her body was recovered below the traverse in a deposition zone consistent with avalanche transport and burial under mixed snow and ice debris. The expedition review identified contributing factors including late descent timing into an afternoon instability window, accumulated fatigue from extended summit rotations, congestion along the fixed line corridor, and the environmental transition zone beneath serac structures. The final assessment pointed to timing on the descent. A short stop during a summit moment pushed her into unstable afternoon conditions where she was caught in fast-moving snow and ice rather than a single mistake. It was July 14th, 2015, and the wind at Camp 4 on K2's Abruzzi Spur had been building since noon. The shoulder sat at roughly 25,000 feet, a tilted shelf of compacted snow where tents huddled in shallow depressions scraped out by ice axes. Above camp, the bottleneck couloir rose toward the summit, a steep gully running directly beneath a hanging serac the size of an office building that could release without warning. At 28,251 feet, K2's summit was over 3,000 vertical feet overhead, and the mountain was telling anyone who would listen the weather was turning. Among those not listening was Laurent Beaumont, a 44-year-old from Lyon, France. Laurent had sold a logistics software company in his late 30s, funding a second career as an adventure athlete. He had summited Broad Peak and Gasherbrum II over the previous 2 seasons, both guided, where Sherpa teams managed logistics while Laurent managed the narrative. Others on K2 that season described him as a client who tipped well and listened poorly, and having gone through dozens of these stories by now, I can tell you that combination is one of the most dangerous things you can bring to the world's highest peak. The expedition's meteorologist had issued an updated forecast that afternoon, The stable window would collapse roughly 12 hours earlier than predicted. Wind above 26,000 feet would exceed 50 miles per hour by late morning on the 15th, with visibility dropping to near zero. The message was clear. Any summit attempt needed to launch by 9 that evening. Kilupemba, Laurent's lead Sherpa, relayed the forecast with a recommendation to wait. Another window was expected in 4 to 5 days. Kilu was 41, with 6 summits above 26,000 feet, including 2 on K2. He had the quiet authority that most clients respected instinctively. Laurent was not most clients. He argued his body was deteriorating, that other teams were launching tonight, and that he would not be left behind. Kilu repeated his concern. The margin was too thin. Laurent responded that he had paid for a summit attempt and expected support. That line, "I paid for a summit attempt," came up over and over when I was piecing this together, and every time it ended the same way. They departed Camp 4 at 9:45 p.m. Laurent moved steadily but slowly, his pace roughly 20% behind schedule. They cleared the bottleneck at approximately 3:30 a.m. and continued to the traverse above, reaching 27,200 feet by 4 a.m. The lightening sky revealed clouds building rapidly along the western horizon. Kilu assessed, at least 4 hours to the summit, the storm arriving in roughly 6. No margin for descent. Kilu told Laurent to turn around. Laurent refused. He could see the summit pyramid, close enough to feel inevitable. 3 climbers from other expeditions had already turned back. Laurent watched them go and interpreted their retreat as weakness. They continued. By 6:30 a.m., visibility had dropped to 200 feet. Wind gusted hard enough to require bracing on the fixed rope. Snow fell horizontally. At 7:15, Kilu stopped and communicated that they were descending immediately. Laurent argued briefly, but the wind had grown strong enough that even his compromised judgment recognized continuing was impossible. The descent through the whiteout was disorienting. Fixed ropes provided a physical guide, but blowing snow erased every visual reference. At approximately 8:40 a.m., Laurent unclipped to adjust his iced-over oxygen mask. His stiff gloves made the procedure slow. When he looked up, the rope had vanished in the whiteout. Kilu, moving ahead with his head down, did not immediately realize Laurent had stopped. Kilu turned back at the next anchor point and found no tension on the rope. He retraced his steps, shouting into wind that carried nothing. He searched for over 40 minutes, traversing back and forth across the slope in conditions threatening his own survival. His fingers burned with cold even inside expedition gloves. He radioed base camp, and the response confirmed what he already knew. No rescue was possible until the storm passed. I keep circling back to those 40 minutes. Kilu searching blind, in a storm for a man who put them both there, knowing every extra minute was costing him something he wouldn't get back. Laurent Beaumont was found 2 days later, approximately 300 feet below the traverse, lying in a position suggesting he had wandered off route. His oxygen mask was partially removed. He was 44 years old. Kilupemba was evacuated with severe frostbite on both hands from the extended search. He lost 3 fingers during surgery in Skardu. The damage ended his career. He returned to Solukhumbu and took work managing a trekking lodge. When asked about K2, he said nothing that anyone repeated. The pattern is familiar. A warning delivered clearly, rejected confidently, and proven right at a cost that can never be recovered. But on K2, that pattern repeats, and the people who suffer most are rarely the ones who made the decision. It was June 28, 2017, and K2 Base Camp sat at 16,400 feet on the Godwin-Austen Glacier, a sprawl of weathered tents and stacked supply barrels spread across gray moraine. The air temperature hovered around 32 degrees Fahrenheit in the midday sun, though a persistent wind from the south cut through layers and carried fine grit into every seam and zipper. Occasional deep shifting sounds rose from the glacier beneath the camp. Above it all, K2 rose in a geometry that photographs never adequately captured. 28,251 feet of limestone, granite, and hanging ice that steepened the higher you looked. The upper pyramid disappearing into a plume of wind-driven snow that streamed eastward like a white flag. The camp was small by Himalayan standards, where Everest Base Camp resembled a crowded village. K2's camp held perhaps 80 people, total across 6 expedition teams. There were no bakeries, no barrel saunas, no satellite internet cafes. Helicopter rescue was extremely limited, rarely possible above the lower camps. The nearest hospital was in Skardu, a multi-day trek to Ascol, followed by a rough vehicle journey. Every serious decision made above this camp carried a weight that Everest did not impose. Among the climbers staged at base camp was Darcy Merritt, a 32-year-old from Scottsdale, Arizona. She had arrived 10 days earlier after the grueling approach trek from Ascole, 70 miles across the Baltoro Glacier, through terrain that filtered out anyone unprepared for sustained discomfort. Darcy had made the trek without incident, though she was consistently among the last to reach each camp, a pattern her social media posts reframed as savoring the journey rather than struggling with the pace. Darcy's climbing career had begun 4 years earlier with a guided ascent of Kilimanjaro that she described as transformative. Within 2 years, she added Elbrus and a trek to Everest Base Camp. Her trajectory accelerated in 2016 when she summited Everest via the Southeast Ridge on a premium guided expedition that cost north of $65,000. The climb had been fully supported, fixed ropes the entire route, Sherpas managing every oxygen swap, camps pre-stocked, and a guide-to-client ratio that left little to individual decision-making. She reached the summit at 1:50 p.m., well past standard turnaround time. Her guides had made the controversial call to let her continue past the turnaround time rather than turn back a paying client within sight of the top. She summited, descended safely with heavy Sherpa assistance, and returned home with photographs that launched a new chapter of her life. And here's the thing that kept circling in my head while I was putting this together: that Everest summit wasn't a green light. It was a warning sign that got repackaged as a credential. Within months, Darcy had repositioned her personal brand around mountaineering. Her background was in digital marketing, 6 years managing social campaigns for lifestyle brands before pivoting to freelance consulting that allowed travel flexibility. She understood audience building intuitively, and her Everest content performed well. Posts framed her as someone who had conquered fear and earned a place among serious climbers. A mid-tier outdoor gear company offered partial funding and equipment for her next expedition in exchange for content deliverables. She chose K2. The decision alarmed people who understood the difference. Everest via the Southeast Ridge, with full support, was a logistical challenge requiring endurance and the ability to follow instructions. K2 via the Abruzzi Spur demanded genuine climbing skill, movement on steep mixed rock and ice, often on fixed lines but requiring real technical ability, with exposure where a slip meant a fall measured in thousands of feet. Historically, K2 had one of the highest fatality rates of any 8,000-meter peak, roughly 1 death for every 4 to 5 summits in earlier decades. Friends urged her to attempt another peak first, Cho Oyu or Manaslu, mountains that bridged the gap between Everest's guided infrastructure and K2's demands. Darcy thanked them for their concern and continued planning. I've spent enough time with K2 stories at this point to know that the gap between what Everest requires and what K2 demands is not a step. It's a cliff, and Darcy was about to walk off it. Her expedition company assigned 2 Nepali high-altitude climbing Sherpas to support her. Furba Thendu was 38 years old, a veteran of 3 K2 summits, 4 Everest summits, and ascents of Lhotse, Makalu, and Broad Peak. He had worked in high-altitude guiding for 16 years, developing a reputation for conservative judgment and quiet authority. This was his planned final expedition season. He and his wife had spent 3 years building a small trekking lodge in the Khumbu Valley, and the K2 contract would fund the final construction phase. He intended to be home by September, finished with the work that had defined his adult life. Kanchanuru was 26, strong and fast, with 2 8,000-meter summits, Broad Peak and Manaslu, and a growing reputation as one of the most capable young high-altitude workers in the industry. He was the eldest of 4 siblings, and his guiding income funded his 2 younger brothers' schooling in Kathmandu and his sister's nursing program. The math of his family's future ran directly through his ability to work at extreme altitude. He looked up to Furba, studied his decision-making, and modeled his own approach on the older guide's discipline. Both men recognized early that Darcy moved poorly on technical terrain. Over the 3 weeks that followed their arrival, the expedition cycled through acclimatization rotations, climbing higher, retreating lower, letting the body adapt. During the first rotation through the Abruzzi Spur's lower sections, she struggled on House's Chimney, a near vertical rock pitch at roughly 21,000 feet that required confident movement on mixed rock and the ice. Furba short-roped her through the most difficult sections. essentially climbing for two while she managed basic crampon placements. The Black Pyramid above, a broken band of steep rock laced with ice and fixed ropes between 22,000 and 23,000 feet, exposed the gap further. She arrived at Camp 2, each rotation well behind other climbers, her pace reflecting not just fitness limitations, but a fundamental unfamiliarity with the movement patterns that technical alpine terrain demanded. On the second rotation, at the base of a steep pitch on the Black Pyramid, she unclipped her pack and held it toward Kancha without a word, just extended it as if he were a bellhop. He was already carrying 60 pounds of expedition gear. He took the pack and said nothing. Ferber raised his concerns privately with the expedition leader during a rest day at base camp. The conversation was honest but constrained. The leader acknowledged that Darcy was among the weaker climbers on the permit, but the company's seasonal finances depended on client retention. Pulling a paying client required a medical justification or a clear safety emergency, not a subjective assessment of ability. The leader told Ferber to continue monitoring and to make the call on summit day if conditions warranted. The responsibility was transferred downward, as it often was. That moment right there is one I keep running into. The guide raises the flag, the system folds it back up, and the person least qualified to assess the risk ends up deciding for everyone. What frustrated Ferber and Kancha more than her climbing was the disconnect between her actual performance and the version she broadcast. At Camp 2, during a rest afternoon at 21,300 feet, Darcy asked Ferber to reclimb a short section of fixed rope so she could film him from above for content she was producing. Ferber declined, visibly uncomfortable but polite. The request treated a working climb as a production set. She was annoyed, but didn't push it. The interaction circulated among other Sherpas and high-altitude workers at the camp, adding to a quiet consensus that Darcy did not understand where she was. Her posts from the acclimatization rotations told a different story. Photos at Camp 2 with the Upper Abruzzi visible behind her, captioned with language about pushing limits and earning the right to stand in places most people only see in photographs. No mention of the short roping, the last place arrivals, or the Sherpas whose skill compensated for her deficits. I went through posts like these while researching the story, and what always gets me is the comment sections. Hundreds of people reinforcing a version of events that the mountain was about to correct in the worst possible way. The summit window opened in mid-July. Weather forecasts showed a narrow period of reduced wind and stable conditions, perhaps 48 hours before the jet stream reasserted itself. The expedition leader briefed all clients on the turnaround protocol. If you have not reached the summit by 2 p.m., you turn around regardless of position. No exceptions. The protocol existed because late summits on K2 meant descending the bottleneck in deteriorating afternoon conditions. When solar warming destabilized the hanging Serac, Darcy nodded and agreed. Everyone always agreed. They departed Camp 4 at 12:15 a.m. on July 22nd, joining a line of headlamps ascending toward the bottleneck. The cold was brutal, minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit before wind chill, and the darkness reduced the world to the small cone of each climber's headlamp and the rasping of crampons on hard snow. Darcy was slow from the first steps. Other teams passed her steadily, moving with the mechanical efficiency of people who understood that speed on K2 was not ambition, it was survival. By the time she reached the base of the bottleneck at approximately 26,200 feet, she was already behind schedule. The bottleneck, a steep couloir of blue ice, sitting directly beneath a massive hanging serac that shed ice unpredictably. Every minute in the gully increased exposure to collapse. The protocol was simple. Move through as fast as possible. Do not stop. Approximately halfway up the bottleneck, Darcy stopped climbing. She unclipped one hand from her ascender, braced her stance awkwardly on the steep ice, and pulled her phone from an inner pocket. She adjusted her goggles onto her forehead, turned her body to frame the serac behind her, and took photographs. She checked the screen, repositioned, and took more. The stop lasted just over a minute. In any other context, a minute was nothing. In the bottleneck, beneath a serac that could release without warning, a minute was obscene. Ferber, clipped to the rope directly behind her, told her to keep moving. She waved him off without turning around. Climbers below were forced to stop on the fixed line. Two attempted to edge past her, shifting their weight onto the rope in ways that transmitted instability to everyone clipped in, above and below. Kancha, positioned higher, kept his eyes on the serac. The ice above was silent, but silence on K2 meant nothing. Darcy finally pocketed the phone, pulled her goggles back down, re-clipped her ascender, and resumed climbing. The moment passed. The damage to her timeline did not. I need you to understand what just happened. She is standing on steep ice, directly beneath a serac that has killed dozens of people, and she's checking the framing on a photo. That image has not left me since I started this one. She cleared the bottleneck and reached the traverse, a long, exposed crossing of steep, mixed terrain above the serac. Her pace deteriorated further. Her foot placements grew imprecise, crampons scraping against rock without finding clean purchase. Her body swaying on the rope in ways that suggested her coordination was beginning to erode. Furba keyed his radio. The transmission was broken, static, clipped fragments, the signal bouncing off rock and ice. The response came through in pieces, but the instruction was clear enough. Turn her around. Furba moved alongside Darcy on the traverse and told her they needed to descend. She was past turnaround time. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She simply did not stop. She kept moving upward, slowly, one mechanical step after another, eyes fixed on the snow ahead. Just a little further. She didn't look at him. She didn't engage with the information. She just kept climbing. That quiet refusal is something I've come across in nearly every story like this. No confrontation, just a person who treats every warning like background noise. It's harder to counter than outright defiance, and far more lethal. Kancha looked to Furba. If he left her, alone above the bottleneck, on terrain this exposed, she would die before nightfall. If he stayed, he might still get her to the summit and back down while daylight held. The first option was certain death. The second was a wager against time that was already losing. He stayed with her, the wrong call made for the right reason. I've gone back and forth on this moment more than any other in this story. Furba made the call that most of us would have made. You don't leave someone alone to die if there's any chance left. But K2 does not grade on intention. Darcy Merritt reached the summit of K2 at approximately 2:30 p.m. on July 22nd, 2017. She stood at 28,251 feet, 30 minutes past the turnaround time that every member of the expedition had agreed to respect. The Karakoram spread in every direction, peaks breaking through cloud layers like islands in a white sea. She took photographs. She posed. Furba checked their remaining oxygen, limited cylinders, running at roughly 2 liters per minute, which gave them a hard limit measured in hours, not comfort. The math had been deteriorating since the bottleneck. Now it was openly hostile. Every minute she spent on the summit subtracted directly from the margin that would keep them alive during the descent. He told her they needed to leave immediately. She took a few more shots, then finally turned downward. 30 minutes past turnaround on K2, oxygen burning down by the minute, and she's still posing for content. I had to go back through the timeline on this section twice because I kept hoping I'd gotten it wrong. The descent began in controlled deterioration. The traverse, which had been slow on the way up, became treacherous on the return. Afternoon sun had softened what had been firm footing into unreliable crust. Darcy's coordination was visibly worse, feet misplacing on holds, her body swaying against the fixed rope, crampons catching on rock rather than biting the ice. Furba and Kancha bracketed her on the traverse, managing her rappel device at each anchor, clipping and unclipping her carabiners because her hands could no longer perform the sequence, guiding her boot placements onto footholds she could not find on her own. The bottleneck waited below. Down climbing it required controlled rappels on the fixed ropes, feeding rope through a descender while maintaining body position on steep ice. Darcy's hands fumbled with the device, her crampons scraped without biting. Furba positioned himself below her, controlling rope tension, while Kancha managed her clip-ins from above. They descended in short, exhausting increments, 10 feet, reset, 10 feet, reset, burning through time and energy at a rate none of them could sustain. Near the base of the bottleneck, at roughly 26,000 feet, the mountain made its own decision. There was no warning sound, just sudden movement above, a section of the hanging serac releasing in a partial collapse that sent ice chunks and debris raking across the couloir. The sound arrived after the movement, a deep cracking report followed by the hiss of accelerating debris. Kancha shoved Darcy sideways on the fixed line, a reflexive motion executed while both were still clipped in. Ice fragments scattered across the slope. A chunk struck Kancha's lower right leg and knee during the movement, a grinding collision that wrenched the joint sideways. He went down hard on the ice, still clipped to the rope. His right knee was already swelling beneath his shell pants, and he could not bear full weight. He was conscious, responsive, and cognitively sharp. He could move with support, but he could no longer function as a guide. And just like that, a 26-year-old's entire career is hanging by the same thread as the woman who put all three of them in this position. That's the part of these stories I can never make peace with. The cost always lands on the wrong person. Two problems now occupied the same section of mountain: an injured Sherpa who could still assist in his own rescue, and a client who was failing in ways that would not reverse at this altitude. Furba keyed his radio again. The transmission was brief. Their position, Concha's injury, the client's condition. Whether the full message reached base camp was uncertain. Other Sherpas and high-altitude workers began mobilizing from Camp 4, but the distance and terrain meant hours before they could arrive. Furba got Concha upright on his left leg, the injured. Right leg held slightly off the ice, the shaft of an ice axe serving as a crude crutch. Concha's face was tight with pain, but his eyes were focused. He understood the situation. He could hop, slide, and descend controlled sections with Furba managing the rope. It would be slow and agonizing, but it was possible. Darcy had stopped functioning. The deterioration was quiet. No screaming, no dramatic collapse. She sat down in the snow and did not respond appropriately to anything said to her. Furba told her to stand. She repeated the word, okay, but did not move. She looked at her hands as if they belonged to someone else. She asked whether they were going to Camp 2, a question that connected to nothing happening around her. Her speech was slow and slurred, her gaze unfocused. Textbook high altitude, cerebral edema. Her brain swelling from sustained exposure to extreme altitude. The cognitive architecture that governed decision-making and self-preservation dissolving in real time. Furba tried to lift her. He pulled her arm, spoke directly into her face, pointed downhill. She smiled at him vaguely and asked again about Camp 2. He braced her weight against his shoulder and attempted to get her to her feet. She did not resist, but she did not help. She was dead weight on a slope steep enough that one person could not move another without risking both their lives. The terrain between their position and Camp 4 required active participation from anyone descending it. She could not participate. The triage was not a decision in any meaningful sense. It was arithmetic. Concha was injured but cognitively present. He could respond to instructions and manage his own clip-ins with one hand. Darcy could not assist in her own rescue. Carrying a non-responsive person down this terrain was physically impossible for one person. Staying longer meant all three die. There is no version of this decision that doesn't leave a permanent mark. I've read accounts from guides who made this exact call on other mountains, and not one of them describes it as a choice. They describe it as the moment the mountain took the last option away. Furba chose Concha. He pulled the younger man's arm across his shoulders, took his weight on the downhill side, and began the slow descent toward Camp 4. He looked back once. Darcy was sitting exactly where he had left her, cross-legged in the snow, her head tilted slightly forward. She was not looking at the mountain, or the sky, or the route below. Her phone rested loosely in one hand. That image, her in the snow with a phone in her hand, while the man who tried to save her walks away. I don't think I'll get past that one. It might be the clearest frame of everything wrong with how this mountain gets treated now. They reached Camp 4 after dark, moving by headlamp across terrain that nearly killed them twice. Concha's injured leg buckling on an ice step, Furba catching him before the fall became unrecoverable. A support team that had staged above Camp 4 met them 400 vertical feet above the tents and took over Concha's weight. Furba sat down outside the tent and did not speak for a long time. Darcy Merritt did not survive the night. She remained above 25,000 feet, motionless, as temperatures dropped to -40 degrees Fahrenheit and wind scoured the face. Without movement, without supplemental oxygen, without shelter, her body lost heat faster than any biological process could replace it. Consciousness faded as the cold reached her core. She was 32 years old. Her body was located the following morning by a team ascending from Camp 4 to retrieve equipment. She was seated in the same position, legs folded, head tilted slightly forward, one hand loosely resting on her phone. The screen was dark. Recovery was deemed too dangerous given the technical terrain, the exposure of the location, and the active Sarek hazard directly above. She remains on K2, as many of its victims do, the steepness, the altitude, and the risk to recovery teams, making retrieval impossible. Kanchanuru was evacuated from base camp by military helicopter to Skardu, then transferred to Islamabad for emergency orthopedic surgery. His right patella was shattered, and the surrounding ligaments were severely torn. 3 surgeries over the following 8 months restored partial mobility, but he never regained the range of motion or the load-bearing capacity required for high-altitude guiding. He was 26 years old. The career that funded his siblings' educations, the work that defined his future, was over. He returned to the Khumbu Valley and took work managing a trekking agency's logistics office, a desk job that kept him connected to the mountains he could no longer climb. 26 years old. A desk job because he was standing next to the wrong client when the SERAC decided to move. I keep running the numbers on stories like these, and they never come out fair. Furba Thendu finished the season and retired from expedition work as he had planned. He returned home, completed construction on the lodge, and opened it the following spring. Trekkers who stayed there in the later years described him as warm, knowledgeable, and generous with route advice. He kept a small collection of summit photographs in the lodge's common room. Broad Peak, Makalu, Everest. K2 was not among them. Those who knew him well, he never spoke about the 2017 season. The expedition company faced scrutiny for allowing a client insufficient technical skill onto K2's summit route. No formal sanctions followed. The climbing community debated the incident in forums and briefings, but the conclusions were familiar. Commercial pressure, client overconfidence, and turnaround times ignored. The same factors that had killed climbers before and would kill them again. Darcy's social media accounts remained active for 4 months after her death, the algorithm continuing to surface her content to followers who did not yet know she was gone. Her final post was a photograph from Camp 4, the upper pyramid of K2 visible behind her tent. The caption read, "Chasing what most people only dream of." Her family took the accounts down in November. It was September 6th, 2016. Fremont Canyon is a narrow granite gorge in central Wyoming, carved into the high plains near Alcova Reservoir. Its walls drop sharply on both sides, threaded with crack routes and multi-pitch technical lines that draw experienced climbers from across the region. From the rim on a clear fall morning, it looks approachable. Bryn Halstead was 38 and worked as a physical therapist in Laramie. She climbed 3 to 4 times a week at an indoor gym and had been doing so for almost 2 years. Strong, coordinated, and genuinely capable on gym routes up to 5.10. She booked a guided technical ascent through a licensed outfitter in late August, rated herself as intermediate to advanced on the intake form, and selected a multi-pitch route that included a crack section rated 5.9. The gap she didn't know existed. Gym climbing does not involve crack technique. A hand jam, where the climber seats their hand inside a vertical rock fissure and applies outward pressure against both walls to generate a hold, has no equivalent in gym movement. She had never placed one. Fremont Canyon's routes shift in character as they gain elevation. The first 2 pitches on the route Bryn selected are face dominant, positive holds, predictable movement, accessible to a competent gym climber. Pitch 3 opens into a sustained hand and finger crack rated 5.9. A grip on the exterior edge provides no load resistance on a vertical pitch, and fall geometry on this section is outward swinging. A climber whose weight sits outside the crack at failure generates a lateral pendulum arc of 8 to 12 feet, enough to contact the adjacent wall or the ledge system below. The day before the ascent, the licensed guide conducted a skills assessment at the canyon base. On a short crack section of the warm-up route, Bryn gripped the exterior edge with her thumb on top. Functional on a low-angle 5.6, useless on a vertical crack under load. He told her the scheduled route required demonstrated crack technique at a 5.8 level and offered 2 alternatives: a face route within her ability, or a rescheduled ascent after a crack clinic. She told him she had not driven 4 hours to climb a beginner route. At 7:44 p.m., he sent a formal written refusal to the outfitter and to her booking contact, stating plainly that her skill level was incompatible with the crack sequence on pitch 3. The next morning, she arrived at the storefront in person, told the front desk she was filing a formal complaint against the guide with a relevant certifying body, and left a signed written note on record. She then located a 26-year-old through a gear shop bulletin board who agreed to guide the same route for $120 Aiken cash. No formal certification, no state licensure, They began the ascent at 10:40 a.m. Pitches 1 and 2 went without incident. Both were face-dominant, and the movement matched her gym experience closely enough to feel familiar. Pitch 3 changed at the 15-foot mark. The informal guide had already led and anchored above. Bryn followed on a top rope belay. At the crux, her right hand gripped the crack exterior rather than seating inside. Her left foot came off the face simultaneously. She came off the wall. The rope caught, but her body position produced a lateral swing of 8 to 10 feet. She contacted the wall, face first on her right side, then swung back across the pitch and struck a ledge outcropping on the left wall with her left hip and lower back. She was conscious after the fall and said she was fine. 20 seconds later, she asked what pitch they were on, the same question she had just answered. The informal guide began lowering her. Midway through the lower, she lost consciousness and did not respond to his voice. He called for help at 12:14 p.m. Signal dropped twice before her position was relayed clearly. Canyon wall clearance prevented aerial access. A rescue team rappelled from the rim and reached her at approximately 2:50 p.m. She was unresponsive throughout. She was pronounced dead at a medical facility at 5:22 p.m. Cause of death was listed as closed head injury and internal hemorrhage, consistent with high-force lateral wall impact and secondary ledge strike. The coroner noted the absence of a helmet as a significant contributing factor. The lateral pendulum arc produced by her fall geometry meant her head contacted exposed granite at speed, with nothing between them. The licensing review centered on the informal guide. He was cited for operating without state licensure and required to cease all commercial guiding activity. No criminal charges were filed. He cooperated fully with investigators, and his account of the fall sequence matched the physical evidence recovered at the scene. Rope position, anchor placement, and transfer markings on the wall at the point of impact. Without contradiction, the original guide was cleared before the review formally concluded. His written refusal had described the pitch 3 crack sequence, the specific technical deficiency he observed during the assessment, and his reasoning for declining the route. Investigators noted that the fall occurred at the exact location and under the exact conditions he had outlined the evening before. There was nothing left for the review to determine about his conduct. The file was closed with no findings against him. It was July 27th, 2018 on K2, deep within the Karakoram Range, along the rugged borderlands between Pakistan and China, where the upper slopes transition into the death zone and weather patterns collapse into sudden wind and whiteout cycles. Lauren Hayes was 34 years old and based in Scottsdale, Arizona, working as a fitness instructor and online wellness coach. Her public identity centered on endurance performance and measurable physical discipline, reinforced through documented ascents of Kilimanjaro, Aconcagua, and Island Peak. Each climb expanded her audience and nourished and increased expectations for the next objective, with K2 positioned as the defining summit. Months before the expedition, she entered sponsorship agreements tied directly to summit-based content delivery. The climb was partially financed through media obligations requiring imagery from the upper mountain, effectively linking summit timing to contractual output. For this purpose, she carried a lightweight, athletic-style dress intended for summit photography, introduced publicly as part of the expedition narrative. That expectation followed her into every logistical and pacing decision on the mountain. When something is tied to the goal like that, it doesn't feel optional anymore. Her prior experience remained limited to guided non-technical and moderate high-altitude climbs, leaving a significant gap compared to sustained technical exposure above 26,000 feet on K2. The expedition moved through the early rotations without anything major going wrong, but things started getting tougher above Camp 2. Lauren began dealing with constant headaches, nausea, and a kind of ongoing fatigue that just didn't really go away between climbs. It was picked up during routine checks, but she kept filming anyway, often pulling off her gloves and face protection in freezing wind just to work the camera, which meant more time exposed while already running on limited oxygen. At Camp 4 near 26,000 feet, she reported poor sleep and limited recovery prior to the summit push. A minor equipment correction involving crampon security was addressed the night before departure, but not escalated. The summit rotation began overnight under heavy traffic as multiple teams converged on a narrow weather window, creating congestion along the bottleneck and traverse with prolonged static exposure in extreme cold. As delays accumulated, oxygen consumption rose beyond planned limits. At this altitude, oxygen functions as a critical physiological support, and depletion directly affects cognition and motor control. Her pace became irregular, with slower transitions and intermittent hesitation at anchor points that normally require near automatic execution. Despite these signs, she continued beyond the safe turnaround window driven by the summit schedule embedded in the expedition's contractual expectations. During descent, worsening wind and limited visibility reduced contrast across the fixed rope system. Snow accumulation obscured anchors and softened terrain definition between sections. Climbing partners later reported prolonged pauses at transitions, where she appeared disoriented and required repeated attempts to re-establish connections between anchors. Investigators later identified probable high-altitude cerebral edema combined with oxygen depletion as key drivers of cognitive breakdown. Decision-making deteriorated under sustained hypoxia, shifting from procedural climbing behavior to impaired sequencing of simple actions. Near a steep section above Camp Fear, she mismanaged a transition between fixed anchors and drifted off the established rope line during a brief sequencing error. From that point, instead of a single fall event, she moved into progressively worsening disorientation in near whiteout conditions. Separated from the main fixed corridor, she continued into terrain with no clear route markers, where overlapping tracks and fresh snowfall eliminated reliable navigation cues. In this environment, small errors in direction compounded rapidly, leading to full loss of route awareness. Whiteout doesn't feel dramatic while you're in it. It just turns everything the same color, and you're guessing if the ground is still there underneath you. As conditions deteriorated further, she was unable to reorient to the fixed line system. Exposure to wind, altitude, and oxygen deprivation led to complete functional collapse in place, rather than a recoverable descent error. Search efforts later confirmed she remained in upper terrain outside the main corridor until conditions allowed recovery access. Her body was found after a weather window opened up, and what they saw pointed to long exposure in extreme cold and altitude-related brain effects that likely led to confusion, loss of coordinations, and getting off the intended route. The expedition review identified severe fatigue, oxygen depletion, and probable high-altitude cerebral edema as primary contributors. It also noted that contractual summit timing pressures, combined with extended filming obligations and oxygen-dependent pacing constraints, contributed to the decision threshold being exceeded, shifting the incident from a controlled descent to a progressive cognitive failure in extreme conditions, rather than a single isolated accident event. It was July 18, 2016, and the morning briefing at K2 Base Camp carried the restless energy of a season approaching its climax. Forecasters predicted a 3-day window beginning July 20th, the best opportunity all season. Teams began final preparations, checking oxygen systems and inventorying supplies at higher camps. Nathan Crowell was 35, a wilderness guide from Montana who had summited Denali 3 times and completed Manaslu the previous year. His experience was legitimate. What was not legitimate was his oxygen plan, and I want to be clear here. Nathan wasn't a fraud or a beginner. He was someone who genuinely belonged on K2 and still made a calculation that killed him, which in some ways makes this one harder to process. Nathan had chosen a Pakistani operator whose fee was roughly 40% below the major companies. The savings came from reduced staffing, fewer oxygen bottles, and minimal contingency supplies. The operator supplied smaller, lighter cylinders than the standard Poisk bottles, each lasting roughly 5 hours at a full flow rate of 2 liters per minute. Nathan carried 3 for summit day, planning to conserve on the lower sections at 1.5 liters per minute and switch to full flow above the bottleneck. By his calculation, 2 bottles would cover the ascent and 1 would carry him back down. The standard recommendation was 4 to 5 bottles, accounting for delays and the universal truth that summit days always took longer than planned. Chiwang Lendu, Nathan's lead Sherpa, raised the issue before the push began. Chiwang was 39, a veteran of 8 26,000-foot summits who had survived a Serac collapse on Annapurna that killed 2 teammates. 3 undersized bottles on K2 set off every alarm in his judgment. He recommended caching a 4th at the top of the bottleneck for descent. Nathan declined. The extra weight would slow his ascent, and his consumption rate on the lower mountain had proven he could stretch the supply. They departed Camp 4 at 10:30 p.m. on July 20th. The night was cold and clear, minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit with wind chill. Nathan moved efficiently through the darkness, passed through the bottleneck without incident, the hanging Serac visible above as a dark mass against the stars, and continued on to the upper slopes as dawn broke across the Karakoram. The summit push took longer than his schedule allowed. Traffic on the upper traverse forced repeated stops, and the final pyramid demanded sustained effort on mixed rock and ice that burned through oxygen faster than the reduced flow could sustain. He switched to full flow well before planned, chewing through his second bottle and dipping into his third before reaching the top. Nathan reached the summit at 1:45 p.m., over an hour behind schedule. He had 1 bottle remaining, already partially depleted. His entire descent supply amounted to roughly 4.5 hours at full flow. The descent would take at least 5. The math worked only if everything went perfectly. Nothing went perfectly. When I first worked through the oxygen numbers for this story, I kept rechecking them because I couldn't believe someone with his experience would cut it that close. The margin, he thought, he had never existed. The descent was slower than the ascent. Depleted legs responded sluggishly. Traffic from late summiting climbers forced delays on narrow sections. Nathan's bottle emptied at approximately 6:20 p.m. He was at roughly 27,000 feet, still above the bottleneck, with at least 3 hours of descent remaining. Within 15 minutes, his pace dropped visibly. Within 30, his breathing had become the rapid, shallow gasping of a body unable to extract oxygen from air that contained almost none. Chiwang offered his own remaining supply. Nathan accepted, but the interruption had triggered deterioration that a partial bottle could not reverse. They entered the bottleneck at 7:10 p.m. in failing light. Nathan's movements had become mechanical, clipping and unclipping with fumbling hands, each transition requiring multiple attempts. At approximately 7:45 p.m., his legs stopped functioning. He sat on the slope and could not stand. The remaining oxygen ran dry. At 26,500 feet in the bottleneck, in the dark, without oxygen, with a body pushed beyond capacity for nearly 22 hours, Nathan had reached the end of what willpower could sustain. Chiwang stayed for over an hour, attempting to revive him, to motivate movement. The responses diminished, slurred words to sounds to silence. When Nathan stopped responding entirely, Chiwang descended alone, reaching Camp 4 at 11 p.m. I spent a long time thinking about that hour Chiwang sat with him, knowing exactly what was happening, unable to change it, choosing to stay anyway. That kind of loyalty doesn't get written about enough. Nathan Crowell was found the following morning, seated on the slope, attached to the fixed rope. He was 35. Chiwang Lendu completed the season and returned to Nepal. He did not accept contracts the following year or the year after. He told colleagues he had spent 15 years watching clients make decisions that killed them, and Nathan had been the last one he was willing to carry. Every bottle counted. Every hour mattered. Every calculation that ignored margins was a gamble placed against a mountain that never lost. It was August 19th, 2015. The sky above the canyon trailhead in Kane County, Utah, was completely clear, pale blue, no wind. 14 miles to the northeast, it had been raining since before dawn. Patrice Cannell was 46, worked part-time at a copy center in Denver, and lived alone in a rented apartment. The private canyon tour she had booked 6 months earlier, $650, paid in full, had been covered with money borrowed from her older brother under the understanding it was for transmission repairs. In the weeks before the trip, she had told co-workers she had invested heavily in a private excursion, emphasizing the private booking over the standard group rate. She arrived that morning with her gear already on, a printed itinerary in hand, 1 water bottle, and no communication device. Slot canyons in southern Utah are drainage corridors carved entirely by water, sitting below the surrounding terrain. Upstream basins can channel precipitation from miles away into a narrow corridor within an hour with no visible surface indication at the entry point. In closed sections, walls rise over 80 feet and passages narrow to 2 or 3 feet, with no high ground, no exit, and no audible warning before a pulse arrives. Operators must suspend all tours under permit when upstream gauges cross defined thresholds. That morning, the threshold had been crossed by 7:45. The evening before, Patrice had called the tour office to confirm her departure. A staff member explained that tours could be suspended if overnight gauge readings reached threshold levels. Patrice told her to note in the booking that general weather advisories did not apply to private tours. The call was logged. Patrice arrived at the office at 8:40 a.m. The lead guide explained the cancellation and pulled up the upstream gauge reading on the monitoring system. He walked her through how a storm miles away produces a flood at the canyon floor with no surface indication at the entry point. She told him the sky was clear and that she did not find the explanation credible. She stated she had paid for a private booking and had waited 6 months. When he held the cancellation, she asked to speak with his supervisor. The owner reviewed the same gauge data and supported the guide without qualification. She turned back to the guide and told him he was the reason the industry was falling apart. He returned to his desk and wrote a formal incident report. The timestamp, 8:57 a.m. She was still in the building when he finished it. On her way out, she took the paper trail map from the display rack near the door. A hiker at the public trailhead parking area later reported seeing a woman, matching her description, enter the canyon mouth alone at approximately 9:20 a.m. At 9:51 a.m., a second surge was recorded at the upstream gauge station, and the flood pulse entered the drainage from the northeast. Based on her entry time and walking pace, Patrice had most likely reached a closed section of the corridor. Walls above 80 feet, passage narrowing to a few feet across, no accessible exits for nearly half a mile in either direction. The pulse moved through at an estimated 15 to 17 miles per hour. Her day pack was recovered the following day, wedged into a wall crack 14 feet above the canyon floor, carried there by the water, not placed. At approximately 9:55 a.m., the hiker at the parking area heard a sustained low rumble from inside the canyon, continuous and directional, unlike anything produced by weather. He moved to the trailhead and waited. She did not come back out. He called for help at 10:02 a.m. The cause of death was listed as drowning, consistent with flood inundation in an enclosed corridor. The coroner found no injuries predating the flood event. Her body was recovered 2.1 miles downstream the following morning, where the canyon opened into a broad wash. The tour operator submitted the guide's incident report alongside the gauge monitoring log, the prior evening's call log, and her original signed liability waiver. The operator was fully cleared. The case was closed. Patrice's brother was contacted as next of kin. When the circumstances were relayed to him, he told the officer he had not known she went to Utah. He said he had thought the money was for transmission repairs. It was July 23, 2016 on K2, the 28,251-foot peak rising in the Karakoram Range near the remote frontier between Pakistan-administered Gilgit-Baltistan and China's Xinjiang region, where steep glacial walls and unstable weather systems dominate the upper mountain. Janessa Cibrian was 31 years old and based in Boulder, Colorado, working as a freelance outdoor photographer, funded through brand partnerships, travel publications, and a growing online audience built around expedition storytelling. She had experience on technical peaks above 18,000 feet, but this was her first attempt on an 8,000-meter summit. In the months before the climb, Janessa developed a summit concept focused on contrast photography, including a white dress image against K2's dark rock and snow. As interest grew, expedition logistics shifted toward supporting filming, with extra camera gear and summit timing tied more closely to media conditions. The team ascended the Abruzzi Spur, a highly exposed route above 26,000 feet where weather, congestion, and narrow margins for error shape every decision. You can tell when gear starts serving the camera more than the climb itself. During acclimatization, progress was generally within expected limits, but guides noted slower recovery and more frequent filming stops. Between Camp 2 and Camp 3, repeated content pauses increased time spent stationary in sub-zero shade, while frequent glove removal for camera use slowed hand recovery and intensified cold exposure effects. By Camp Fur, right near the death zone, the forecast was already tightening up, with winds picking up earlier than expected. Even so, the team still went for the summit during one of the busiest climbing windows. By the time everyone funneled into the bottleneck and the traverse, it wasn't really moving anymore. Just long waits on fixed lines, people standing still in brutal wind and cold, hoping the line ahead would finally clear. During a prolonged congestion period, she paused for a brief, filmed segment tied to the summit narrative. Although short in intent, the stop occurred at peak traffic, leaving her stationary on the rope system for an extended interval in temperatures between -15 degrees Fahrenheit and -25 degrees Fahrenheit, with sustained wind chill. After resuming movement, climbers noted early cold impairment, including reduced dexterity, slower hardware handling, and diminished responsiveness during rope transitions. Everyone around just waits in silence during those bottlenecks. On the descent below the summit traverse, her pace became increasingly uneven. She showed worsening cold stress, slower clipping and unclipping, reduced grip strength, and difficulty maintaining footing on wind-scoured ice. These effects, initially subtle, intensified as exertion rose and oxygen demand increased. Conditions deteriorated further below the bottleneck traverse as visibility dropped, and wind strengthened, with refreezing terrain making movement more technical. She fell behind her climbing partners during an oxygen exchange near a fixed anchor, where delays increased exposure in the death zone. From there, the situation shifted from isolated delay to progressive impairment. Extended static exposure and hypoxia reduced peripheral circulation and fine motor control. Climbers later described difficulty with basic rope tasks, often requiring repeated attempts to clip and adjust gear. As she continued downward, stops became longer and more frequent. Investigators later reconstructed a gradual shutdown consistent with severe hypothermia progression, starting with loss of dexterity, followed by slowed decision-making and reduced coordination, requiring repeated pauses to stabilize equipment between fixed sections. Eventually, she was no longer able to maintain continuous movement with the group. Separated by distance and worsening weather, she became stationary on exposed terrain below the traverse. In this phase, wind exposure, low oxygen saturation, and prior prolonged immobility combined to rapidly reduce functional warmth, particularly in the extremities. Her condition slowly turned into a prolonged hypothermic collapse where she could move less and less until she stopped moving at all. Nearby climbers couldn't safely reach her because of poor visibility, avalanche risk, and unstable conditions along the fixed-line corridor with heavy descent traffic. Her body was recovered during a brief weather window 2 days later below the bottleneck route. Recovery teams documented findings consistent with severe hypothermia following extended high-altitude exposure, along with cold-related tissue damage and minor injuries consistent with uncontrolled movement on steep terrain before death. The expedition review identified a convergence of contributing factors rather than a single point of failure: delayed timing during summit congestion, extended stationary exposure during filming intervals, high-altitude hypoxia, progressive loss of dexterity in extreme cold, and reduced capacity to safely manage descent systems once impairment began. The final assessment described a gradual, exposure-driven failure of function, unfolding during descent, rather than a single acute accident event. It was May 3rd, 2016. Mera Peak stands at 21,247 feet in Nepal's Khumbu region, placing its upper slopes above most of the world's breathable atmosphere. High Camp sits at roughly 19,400 feet, where the air before dawn runs below 10 degrees Fahrenheit, and the summit is less than 2,000 vertical feet away. At that elevation, the body's margin for error is effectively gone. Renata Clifford was 44 and worked at a marketing firm in Portland, Oregon. She had taken up climbing in her late 30s, 5 years of Colorado 14ers, accumulated gear, and a habit of describing her experience in detail to anyone who asked. Mera Peak was the next logical step by her own accounting. She booked an 18-day guided expedition through a licensed outfitter in Kathmandu, arrived with a printed checklist pulled from a mountaineering forum, and had a return flight locked in for May 7th. She had communicated the departure date to the outfitter before leaving Portland and treated it on the mountain the same way she had communicated it, as a fixed condition, not a preference. At 21,247 feet, oxygen partial pressure is roughly 45% of what it is at sea level. Even well-acclimatized climbers at high camp operate with blood oxygen saturation in the low to mid-80s. High-altitude pulmonary edema develops when the lungs respond to hypoxic conditions by allowing fluid to leak into the alveolar tissue. The lungs begin filling from within. First signs are breathlessness at rest and a wet, productive cough. Confusion follows, often with the person still insisting they are fine. The window between first clinical symptoms and incapacitation is 6 to 12 hours. Supplemental oxygen slows the progression. Only descent stops it. On day 9, during an acclimatization rotation, the lead Sherpa recorded Renata's resting blood oxygen saturation at 74%, low even by high-altitude standards, and recommended a rest day before any further ascent. She pulled out her printed expedition itinerary, pointed to the summit window, and told him the schedule had been confirmed with the outfitter before departure, and that a rest day was not part of what she had paid for. He noted the exchange and said nothing further. On day 12 at high camp, his morning assessment found her reporting chest tightness she attributed to cold air. He asked her to take a full deep breath. She could not complete it without a wet, productive cough that stopped several other clients mid-preparation. Her SpO2 reading 68%. During the conversation that followed, she lost her train of thought twice within the same exchange. He told her plainly she needed to descend that morning. The summit attempt was finished. In front of 4 clients and the second Sherpa, Renata told him he was there to carry gear, not to make medical decisions. She dismissed him by name, instructed the second Sherpa to take her rope, and told the group to stop taking direction from him. He did not argue. He transferred his observation log, SpO2 readings, timestamps, written assessment, directly to the second Sherpa, radioed base camp, and began his descent per protocol. The second Sherpa, 23 years old and on only his second summit rotation, had no contractual authority to force a descent. He documented her condition in his own field notes and continued preparing the group. That evening, clients in adjacent tents reported a persistent wet cough from her side of camp from around 9 p.m. through midnight. After midnight, it stopped. At 5:20 a.m. on May 4th, the second Sherpa opened her tent for the summit departure call. She was on her back, unresponsive, lips faintly cyanotic, sleeping bag saturated with perspiration, despite overnight temperatures below 10 degrees Fahrenheit. He radioed base camp at 5:23 a.m. Helicopter response was denied. Aircraft could not safely operate above 18,000 feet, and the nearest viable landing zone was more than 3,000 vertical feet below. 2 clients began CPR under his direction and continued for 11 minutes. There was no response. She was pronounced dead at high camp. Cause of death was high-altitude pulmonary edema. The coroner's report, processed at a medical facility in Kathmandu, listed the 68% SpO2 reading recorded that morning as clinically consistent with end-stage pulmonary fluid accumulation. The timeline in the lead Sherpa's field log matched the coroner's findings point for point. The morning assessment, the wet cough, the confusion. What he had written at high camp became the clinical record that explained everything found in her tent 14 hours later. Both Sherpas submitted their field notes to the outfitter's internal review, and a separate report filed through the appropriate foreign affairs channels. The lead Sherpa was fully cleared. The review noted that his documentation before descending was the only reason the sequence of events could be reconstructed with the precision the report required. Body recovery from glaciated terrain required 3 additional days and coordination with 2 neighboring Sherpa teams. The outfitter revised their client agreement within 6 months. A mandatory descent clause, giving the lead Sherpa unilateral authority to initiate client descent without consent in cases of clinical altitude illness presentation. The clause did not exist the morning she handed over her rope. It existed because of it. It was August 2nd, 2014, and Camp 3 on K2 sat at roughly 24,000 feet, anchored to a steep snow slope where the mountain briefly relented before rearing toward the shoulder. The tents were pitched on platforms chopped into hardpack, and the air was thin enough that experienced climbers paused between sentences to breathe. Elliot Marsh was 28, a freelance photographer from Bristol who had built a modest following documenting adventure sports. His mountaineering experience consisted of Mont Blanc, a guided island peak ascent, and an abandoned Denali attempt. K2 was a leap his experience did not justify, and several people had told him so. He had secured a spot with a Pakistani operator whose screening prioritized payment over qualification. When I came across the details of his application and matched it against what K2 actually demands, I genuinely could not understand how anyone signed off on it. His assigned Sherpa was Kancha Nuru, 33, from near Lukla, with 4 26,000-foot summits, including Kangchenjunga. Kancha was reserved, the kind of guide who watched more than he spoke, and formed assessments through observation. Within a week, he had identified Elliot as the weakest climber in the expedition, not in fitness, but in altitude tolerance. The signs appeared early. During the second acclimatization rotation at Camp 2, Elliot developed a persistent headache he attributed to dehydration. Kancha noted it. The headache persisted overnight, accompanied by nausea that Elliot dismissed as normal adjustment. At base camp, the symptoms resolved and Elliot's confidence rebounded. Kancha remained uncertain. The summit push began July 31st. The climb to Camp 2 went smoothly, but on the ascent to Camp 3, the headache returned within 2 hours. Elliot treated it with ibuprofen and mentioned it to Kancha as minor discomfort. Kancha asked directly about nausea, dizziness, and visual disturbance. Elliot denied all three. And this is the part that frustrated me most putting this together. A Sherpa with 4 26,000-foot summits is asking the exact right diagnostic questions, and the client looks him in the face and lies. At Camp 3, another climber observed Elliot stumbling between tents, brief, easily dismissed as exhaustion, but consistent with ataxia, the loss of coordination indicating the brain was beginning to swell. The climber mentioned it to Kancha, who confronted Elliot directly. Elliot insisted he was fine. Tired, yes. Headache, mild, but fine. He demonstrated coordination with exaggerated care that suggested he knew he was being evaluated. Kancha recommended descending to Camp 2. Elliot refused, arguing every climber felt terrible at 24,000 feet. The expedition leader, who had limited medical training, deferred to Elliot's self-assessment on the basis that the climber was verbal, ambulatory, and making clear decisions. They departed Camp 3 at 4 a.m. on August 2nd. Within 45 minutes, Elliot's pace had dropped to half the group average. He stopped frequently, leaning on his ice axe, each rest longer than the last. At approximately 24,800 feet, less than 200 vertical feet below Camp 4, Elliot sat down and did not get up. His speech was slurred, responses delayed by seconds. When Kancha asked him to touch his nose, his hand wavered and missed by inches. HACE had progressed past the point where descent alone might reverse it. I've read enough about cerebral edema to know that by the time someone can't touch their own nose, the window is almost closed. Elliot had been walking past that window for days. Kancha radioed Camp 4 and began moving Elliot downward, but Elliot resisted with the irrational combativeness characteristic of advanced cerebral edema, his swelling brain no longer producing coherent thought. 2 additional Sherpas arrived within 30 minutes. Together, they moved him roughly 400 feet before his body stopped cooperating entirely. He lost consciousness at 7:30 a.m., breathing falling into the irregular Cheney-Stokes pattern that indicated severe neurological failure. Elliot Marsh never regained consciousness. Dexamethasone was administered, but could not reverse days of accumulated damage. He died at approximately 2:15 p.m. on August 2nd, 2014. He was 28 years old. Kancha Nuru sustained a severe lumbar strain from the hours carrying Elliot across steep terrain. The injury never fully resolved. He attempted one more expedition the following year and was forced to turn back when the pain made load carrying impossible. He retired from high-altitude work at 34 years old, career finished, because he spent hours hauling a man down a mountain who had no business being on it in the first place. That math never balances. Every warning had been given. Every signal the human body produces to say it is failing was present. None of it mattered, because the person receiving the warnings had already decided they did not apply to him. It was July 22nd, 2017. The south rim of the Grand Canyon sits at nearly 7,000 feet. where late July mornings run mild and the sky opens wide above the canyon edge. 4,000 feet below, the inner gorge operates under an entirely different climate. Dark canyon walls absorbing and radiating heat through the afternoon with almost no airflow at depth. By midday, the canyon floor routinely reaches temperatures the rim never approaches. Marta Devon was 54 and had recently retired from a career in school library work in Columbus, Ohio. She was organized in the specific way that people who spend careers cataloging information tend to be. She arrived with a folder, printed resources, and cross-referenced notes. The problem was her sources. Her entire itinerary had been built from a travel blog written by someone who had completed the same trail in late September, a month when the inner canyon runs close to 30 degrees cooler than July. The departure time, the water recommendations, the expected conditions, all pulled from a post that had no bearing on what she was walking into. She carried 2 liters of water for a 9.5-mile one-way descent to the river. She had no desert hiking experience. The canyon's heat is not simply a function of air temperature. The walls, dense, dark, metamorphic rock, absorb solar radiation through the morning and release it at ground level through the afternoon, creating a radiant heat environment that persists regardless of cloud cover or time of day. Late July monitoring consistently records canyon floor temperatures between 110 and 118 degrees Fahrenheit between noon and 5 p.m. Without sufficient hydration, the body's sweating mechanism eventually shuts down entirely and core temperature climbs unchecked. The posted water minimum for a full river descent in July is 4 liters per person, with enforced rest at each rest house during peak heat hours. 3 heat advisory signs were posted at the trailhead that morning. A ranger was stationed there, specifically for heat intercepts, a standard summer assignment. He approached Marta at 11:42 a.m. and told her the canyon floor would reach between 110 and 115 degrees Fahrenheit by early afternoon. He pointed out that her water supply was less than half the posted minimum for her stated destination. She produced the printed blog itinerary from her bag, held it flat between them, and pointed to the departure time on the page, indicating the source had a large readership and that his advisory contradicted published trail data. He told her the blog was not a safety source and did not step aside. She opened her small notebook, located his badge number on his uniform, and wrote it down in deliberate block letters without looking away from him. She told him she would be filing a formal complaint with his supervisor before she returned that evening. Then she walked around him and started down the trail. He completed his written incident log at 11:49 a.m., noting her name, destination, observed water supply, and the full exchange in sequence. Canyon floor temperature reached 112 degrees Fahrenheit by 2 p.m. Her personal GPS unit showed her last recorded movement at a point 0.3 miles below the 3-mile rest house at 2:17 p.m., with no movement after that timestamp. A group of 4 ascending hikers passed a woman resting against the canyon wall near that location at approximately 2:45 p.m. She did not respond when 2 of them acknowledged her as they passed. They assumed she was resting and kept moving. A second group of 2 hikers found her unresponsive on the trail at 3:30 p.m., roughly 80 feet from where the first group had seen her. Both water containers were empty. Her skin was hot and dry to the touch, with no perspiration, consistent with heat stroke at the stage where the sweating mechanism has failed entirely. One hiker carried a satellite communicator and activated an emergency signal at 3:34 p.m. A rescue team was inserted to the nearest accessible point and reached her at approximately 4:15 p.m. Field assessment indicated core temperature above 106 degrees Fahrenheit. She was packaged, airlifted to the rim, and transferred by ground to a medical facility. She was pronounced dead that evening. Cause of death was listed as hyperthermia. Core temperature at admission was 107.2 degrees Fahrenheit. Contributing factors included midday descent and extreme ambient heat, critically insufficient water supply, and no rest or turnaround behavior recorded at any point along the route. The ranger's incident log, time-stamped 11:49 a.m., 2 hours and 28 minutes before her GPS stopped, was submitted alongside the GPS track data and witness statements from both hiker groups. He was fully cleared. Evidence returned to next of kin included the GPS unit, 2 empty water bottles, the printed blog itinerary, and a small notebook open to the first page, where his badge number was written in large, careful block letters. It was the last thing she had written. It was July 29th, 2013, on K2, the second highest mountain on Earth, standing within the Karakoram Range in the far northern reaches of the region, bordering Pakistan and China, where deep avalanche-prone valleys feed into one of the most technically demanding high-altitude environments in the world. Leisha Huesca was 36 years old and based in Seattle, Washington, working as a videographer specializing in outdoor wedding films and remote elopement documentation. Her career had gradually expanded from accessible wilderness filming into high-altitude alpine environments, with K2 representing the furthest extension of that progression. She had prior experience on Denali and Cho Oyu, but limited exposure to sustained technical climbing at extreme altitude. The expedition was structured as a documentary project that initially included a lightweight dress concept tied to pre-expedition promotional material and sponsorship expectations for summit imagery. Early into the climb, she ended up dropping the dress before the higher camps once it became clear it just wasn't practical in those conditions. It did lighten her load, but it also left her with this lingering mental pressure, like the story she'd built around the summit didn't quite match what was actually happening on the mountain anymore. She joined a commercial expedition using shared fixed-line infrastructure across the upper route, where multiple teams converged during narrow weather windows, creating congestion in key technical sections of the ascent. Things quickly stacked up here. Too many people, too little space. From early rotations, she carried filming equipment alongside standard climbing gear, increasing fatigue and slowing recovery between camps. As altitude increased, cold exposure and oxygen limitation began compounding normal exertion, reducing efficiency during repeated climbs and descents between camps. At higher elevations near the start of the death zone, extended exposure during congested fixed-line sections led to prolonged stationary periods in extreme cold. Without the added insulation buffer originally planned for the summit concept, she relied entirely on standard expedition layering, which became increasingly marginal under wind and static exposure conditions. By the summit rotation, weather conditions deteriorated beyond forecast expectations. Wind speeds increased and temperatures dropped further during the summit window, while congestion along fixed ropes forced repeated stops in exposed positions. These pauses increased total time spent immobile, limiting the body's ability to maintain core temperature. During descent, her pace became progressively more conservative. The earlier decision to abandon the dress removed a physical hazard, but did not resolve the psychological tension tied to the summit narrative. Climbers later noted she adopted a cautious, delayed rhythm at anchor transitions, prioritizing stability over group pace. This conservative pacing gradually separated her from faster-moving teams on the fixed lines. Sometimes slowing down feels safer, even when it quietly puts distance between people. As separation increased, she entered sections of the route alone, or with reduced visual contact with other climbers. Intermittent weather changes reduced visibility and erased clear reference points along the rope corridor. When conditions briefly worsened, she stopped at a fixed anchor to wait for regrouping that never fully reformed. That stop ended up dragging on as the wind picked up and the temperature kept dropping. With no safe way to move alone and already struggling to stay warm after sitting still for so long, she stayed put through the night as conditions got worse. With limited movement, repeated glove exposure during minor gear adjustments, and reduced caloric and thermal recovery capacity at altitude, her ability to rewarm declined steadily. The psychological hesitancy that had begun earlier in descent translated into delayed decision-making, keeping her stationary rather than committing to risky movement in low visibility. By morning, she was no longer responsive to changing conditions along the route. Recovery was only possible during a later weather window, when teams regained access to the section. She was found in a stationary position along the descent line, consistent with prolonged exposure rather than a single traumatic event. The expedition review identified a sequence of contributing factors: abandonment of the dress early in the climb, removing a physical hazard but leaving an unresolved psychological anchor in her decision-making, conservative pacing during descent leading to gradual separation from the group, and eventual forced isolation during worsening weather. The final assessment concluded that the fatal outcome resulted from cumulative exposure and stationary overnight hypothermia, where the primary mechanism was not a discrete accident, but a progressive inability to transition from caution into movement in a collapsing weather window. It was August 9th, 2015, and the route between Camp 2 and Camp 3 on K2 crossed some of the most avalanche-prone terrain on the mountain. The section between 22,000 and 23,500 feet traversed steep snow slopes where wind-deposited slabs lay over weaker layers, configurations that any avalanche forecaster would have flagged immediately. On K2, that assessment fell to climbers and Sherpas who read the snow through experience, intuition, and respect for what they could not see beneath the surface. Werner Steinbach was 47, an Austrian alpinist from Innsbruck with a resume stretching back 3 decades. He had climbed north faces in the Alps, established new routes in Patagonia, and summited 3 26,000-foot peaks in alpine style. Fast, light, no supplemental oxygen. He was skilled, experienced, and built his identity on doing things differently from commercial climbers he quietly disdained. He viewed fixed ropes as crutches, Sherpa support as a convenience that weakened the experience, and the commercialization of the Karakoram as something that degraded the mountains he had loved since his 20s. I'll say this, of the 5 people in this video, Werner is the only one I'd call a genuinely accomplished climber, and that makes what happened harder to dismiss, because this wasn't ignorance, was pride. He had joined a small independent expedition that shared logistics but climbed independently. His nearest Sherpa contact was Ngawang Tendi, 29, from the Rolwelling Valley, responsible for maintaining fixed ropes between camps. Ngawang was young but had 3 26,000-foot summits and a natural fluency on steep ice. He had been watching Werner's route choices with growing concern. On 2 previous acclimatization rotations, Werner had left the fixed rope route to climb adjacent terrain he considered more direct. Each time he moved through slopes the Sherpas had deliberately avoided due to avalanche risk. Each time, nothing happened, which Werner interpreted as validation and the Sherpas interpreted as luck. That distinction is everything. Same outcome. 2 completely different conclusions about what it meant. I've seen that pattern end one way every single time. On the evening of August 8th, Ngawang approached Werner at Camp 2 and described conditions above. Recent snowfall had deposited fresh slab over an older, weaker layer on the slopes flanking the fixed rope route. The standard path followed a rocky rib that provided natural protection. The couloir Werner had used previously was loaded and dangerous. Ngawang was specific. The couloir should not be entered until the snowpack had stabilized. Werner thanked him and said nothing about his plans. Other climbers noticed him studying the couloir through binoculars that evening. Werner departed Camp 2 at 5:30 a.m. on August 9th. Ngawang was already on the fixed rope route above, ferrying oxygen to Camp 3. At approximately 6:15 a.m., he saw a single figure leave the fixed route at 22,400 feet and traverse toward the couloir. The deliberate, efficient movement identified the climber as Werner. Ngawang radioed base camp. The response was immediate. Someone needed to contact Werner, but Werner was not carrying a radio. He climbed alone, as he preferred, with only the equipment he deemed essential. And this is the detail that still gets to me. He wasn't just ignoring a warning, he had made himself unreachable by design. The philosophy he was proudest of is the same thing that guaranteed no one could stop him. Werner entered the couloir at 6:30 a.m., ascending at a pace reflecting decades of alpine experience. The snow surface appeared firm. Every external sign suggested safe conditions. But the danger lay beneath. Faceted crystals formed during a cold period 2 weeks earlier, buried under 16 inches of wind-packed slab. At approximately 6:45 a.m., 300 feet up the couloir, the slab fractured. The crack shot outward from beneath his feet in both directions, splitting the snowpack along the buried weak layer. The slope began to move. Ngawang, watching from the fixed route roughly 200 feet away, saw the fracture line appear. The avalanche was not enormous, a slab roughly 80 feet wide and 400 feet long, but it moved with force that made size irrelevant. Werner disappeared into the churning debris within seconds. The slide channeled into a narrowing section, accelerated over a rock band, and deposited everything 600 vertical feet below in a fan of compacted snow. A search team reached the debris within 90 minutes. They probed for 2 hours across snow that had set like concrete. Werner Steinbach was found 4 feet below the surface, with trauma consistent with impact against the rock band. He was 47 years old. Ngawang Tendi was physically unharmed. He had watched a man he warned walk into a slope he had specifically identified as dangerous, unable to do anything except observe the result. He completed the 2015 season, worked one more expedition on Manaslu the following spring, and then stopped. He told friends in Roll Whaling he was done watching people choose how they died. He was 29 when he retired from high-altitude work. 29. I keep coming back to that number. Most people are just getting started at 29, and Ngawang was already done, not from injury, but because he couldn't watch one more person die after being told exactly what would happen. 5 climbers, 5 warnings delivered clearly by people whose job it was to keep them alive. 5 decisions to ignore expertise in favor of confidence, ambition, or impatience. K2 did not punish them for being on the mountain. It punished them for believing they knew better than the people who understood it. And in every case, the cost extended beyond the person who made the choice, reaching into the lives of Sherpas who carried the weight of someone else's decisions long after the mountain had finished with them. It was February 14th, 2017. The temperature at the trailhead in the Bob Marshall Wilderness was 17 degrees Fahrenheit when the group assembled, and the wind out of the northwest was already pulling it lower. Delia Harmon was 52 and worked dispatch at a trucking company in Bozeman. She had signed up for the trip after her sister described the route as manageable, without mentioning she had gone in October. Delia came in February. She had not responded to either of the outfitters' pre-trip gear confirmation emails and arrived with ski resort snow pants, a fleece mid-layer, and a sleeping bag borrowed from a neighbor the night before. She said nothing about any of it. When the guide's assistant tried to follow up at check-in, she answered with a single word and turned away. The Bob Marshall Wilderness in mid-February is among the coldest interior corridors in the continental United States. Daytime temperatures at elevation average 15 to 18 degrees Fahrenheit, with overnight lows in exposed drainages dropping below minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit. The route crossed 2 frozen creek beds. The second had a compromised ice layer from a brief warming period 4 days prior, with water still actively moving beneath the surface. Cold water immersion at those temperatures saturates insulating layers immediately, and with continued wind exposure and physical exertion, the body loses core heat faster than it can produce it. Without a dry layer exchange, the window from immersion to dangerous core temperature loss runs between 45 and 90 minutes. At the trailhead, the lead guide opened the mandatory safety briefing and began a visual gear check. He noted Delia's layering system and snow pants, neither rated for backcountry winter conditions. But before he could address it directly, she stood, announced the group was wasting time, and started up the trail. 2 clients followed before he could finish. He completed the briefing for those who remained, which meant the crossing protocol for the second creek was never fully delivered to the group. At mile 3.1, he stopped everyone at the bank and began explaining the crossing procedure. Delia was already at the water's edge. On her 3rd step, the ice fractured beneath her, and she went into mid-thigh on both legs before he pulled her to the far bank. He called for evacuation immediately and told her the wet clothing needed to come off for a dry layer swap. He had insulation in his pack. She refused. She demanded his certification number and said she would have him reported to the relevant licensing authority before the week was out. When 2 other clients moved to back the guide, she waved them off and walked ahead in soaked clothing. He logged the time at 1:47 p.m. and radioed base. Her pace dropped within minutes. By 700 feet from the crossing, her arms had stopped swinging and her steps had shortened to a shuffle. At 800 feet, she stopped moving and lowered herself into the snow. He reached her in under 2 minutes. She was conscious but not coherently responsive. She asked what time it was told, then asked again within 30 seconds. He set up a windbreak with 2 clients, removed her wet layers, replaced them with dry insulation from his pack, and activated heat packs against her torso and neck. Approximately 15 minutes after he reached her, the shivering stopped. A body stops shivering when it no longer has the capacity to generate the effort. A ground rescue team was dispatched, but terrain and distance put their arrival more than 4 hours out. Aerial extraction was not viable. Tree canopy across the route eliminated any landing or cable option. The team reached her position after dark. She had been unresponsive for more than 4 hours and remained so through the full transport to a medical facility. Delia Harmon was pronounced dead that evening. Core temperature at admission was 77 degrees Fahrenheit. Cause of death was listed as fatal hypothermia, with contributing factors including cold water immersion in sub-freezing conditions, refusal of immediate field clothing exchange, and sustained physical exertion in saturated layers following immersion. The guide's field log, radio records, and 4 client witness statements were submitted to the licensing review. He was cleared without conditions. Among his documented gear that day was an emergency insulation kit he had packed after noting her clothing at the trailhead. Extra weight he had carried for a client who never acknowledged the problem. It was the only reason there was anything to work with when she went down.